So, as mentioned, I'm going to be presenting on the sage-grouse. And first, I just want to introduce AWA. So, we are a nonprofit environmental organization focused on advocacy, and we work throughout Alberta mostly to try and advocate for environmental protection, for wild spaces, and to try and establish a network of protected areas across the province. So, oops. So the greater sage-grouse has been a specific focus of AWA for a while now. The sage-grouse are a bird endemic to North America. Currently, they're only found in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and parts of the United States. And they're best known for their lekking behavior. So every spring, the males will gather on these open spaces called leks, where they'll perform their mating rituals to try and attract females. And sage-grouse are known for, in their white rough feathers, they have these two yellow throat sacs that they'll inflate and deflate. And the important thing about these leks is that they will return to them year after year. So the sage-grouse are considered an indicator species for the sagebrush ecosystem, which hosts a lot more than just sage-grouse. The sagebrush plant itself is really important because it helps to improve soil quality, which benefits a lot of other prairie plants. And it can also control pests and invasive species. It also shelters invertebrates and herbivores, including some larger grazers such as rabbits, elk, pronghorn, deer, and those in turn support a lot of the larger predators that are found throughout the Great Plains. So all in all, the sagebrush ecosystem has been estimated to support roughly 350 species across the entire North American Great Plains. The sage-grouse decline was very closely associated to the loss of sagebrush habitat. This happened in two main stages. The first with settlement in the 16 to 1800s. A lot of native prairie was converted to farmland. There were roads, buildings, all of this which fragmented the ecosystem and vastly changed the habitat. A second wave happened with energy development in the 18 to 1900s. With rising demand for oil and gas, there was more fragmentation and degradation of these habitats, and especially the noise and disturbance associated with drilling was found to be very detrimental to sage-grouse. Periods of really high petroleum activity are closely linked to very severe sage-grouse declines. So by 1968, people were noticing that these abundant birds were not so abundant anymore. And so a count in 1968 revealed 613 males in Alberta, and this number continued to decline over the years. In 1998, they were officially declared endangered federally, and 2 years later, they were declared endangered in Alberta as well. In 2008, the first recovery strategy for sage-grouse was released. This was a federal recovery strategy that listed goals to try and recover the species. However, it failed to identify any critical habitat. And without critical habitat, recovery of the species would be very difficult. So AWA, along with several other environmental nonprofit organizations, retained Ecojustice to challenge this decision to exclude critical habitat from the strategy. They said there should be enough information to identify any critical habitat and that it needs to be included. Eventually, in 2009, the court sided with Ecojustice. They said that under the Species at Risk Act, critical habitat was a requirement and not a recommendation, which resulted in critical habitat at last being added to this recovery strategy. Despite all of this, by 2012, there were only 13 males remaining in Alberta. So in September of 2011, with no sign of sage-grouse recovery, AWA hosted an emergency sage-grouse summit. This summit invited experts on sage-grouse to come and talk about what would be needed to recover the species. A communique came out of this, the main message of which was that there was not enough being done to protect the species and that urgent action was needed. In response to this, in November, a legal petition for an emergency protection order was submitted. So under the Species at Risk Act, the minister can issue an emergency order if they believe that there's an imminent threat to the species' recovery or survival. There was a deadline for this order, which was missed, and that resulted in a challenge after several court cases. Eventually, in September, Canada at last announced the intent for an EPO for this greater sage-grouse. The EPO was published in December and, despite pushback, went into effect in February of 2014. So this is a map showing where the EPO was. It was based on the critical habitat that was identified for the recovery strategy, and it was mostly aimed at limiting destruction of native plants and habitat and reducing things like noise and development in these critical areas. Along with the emergency protection order, with people noticing the sage-grouse plight, there were other conservation projects. There was translocation from Montana used to boost the local populations. There's a captive breeding program that the Wilder Institute has been running aimed at raising chicks and releasing them into the wild. There have also been habitat improvement projects. So things like removing fencing and replacing fencing with wildlife-friendly fencing, or removal of abandoned structures, and site rehabilitation, mostly aimed at the abandoned oil and gas structures in the area. So with all of that, there are still several threats to the greater sage-grouse. The most recent one has been helium. So helium recently has helium stocks have been low because the US stocks are starting to run low. And because of this, helium prices have jumped. The problem is that a lot of this helium exploration seems very interested in the southeast corner of Alberta, and that's the last sanctuary in the province for sage-grouse. Helium has a lot of the same tools and techniques as oil and gas. So considering that sage-grouse were very sensitive to oil and gas, we'd expect that helium would have very similar results and could be very devastating for the small population remaining. Along with helium, there's other threats, including disease, again, because it's a small population, so any disease could be very severe and very devastating. Energy development, both oil and gas, and recently renewable energies that are trying to encroach on some of the native prairie. Agriculture, especially conversion of native habitat to cropland and irrigation. And climate change, partly just because we don't know how well this species and the remnant populations will adapt to any new changes. So I wanted to show this map, which shows the current sage-grouse range. The core range is in pink, and the recovery area is in red. The orange part shows the critical habitat and the area of the federal emergency protection order. So you can see that it only covers a portion of the sage-grouse range. The gray area shows human impact. There's already been quite a bit of human development in that range. With all that, how are the sage-grouse doing now? Well, as mentioned, in 1968, there were over 600. By 2012, there were only 13. And in 2014, the emergency protection order went into effect. So if we focus on the last 10 years, after the emergency protection order and with the other conservation efforts, there was a slight increase in sage-grouse population numbers to 43 counted in 2017, but this has again declined and there were only 22 counted last year. So the goal listed by the by the federal recovery strategy is to have 1,095 adults among 16 leks in Alberta, which means counting at least 365 males. So we still have a ways to go. In order to recover sage-grouse, we're going to need sufficient undisturbed habitat with cover for the sage-grouse to meet their lekking, mating, and feeding needs. And in order for this to happen, we can't have any new development in the small sage-grouse range remaining. We also need to restore habitat that's been disturbed and degraded, and preferably we'd like at least a 15-kilometer zone of influence around the critical habitat. So what AWA has been doing is trying to gain the attention of the federal and provincial governments. We're requesting an extension of the protection. We're asking for policies to cease the loss of more native prairie, and also for incentives to accelerate reclamation and habitat improvement. Until the sage-grouse have their habitat requirements met, we're not going to be able to achieve a sustainable population on the landscape. So if any of this interests you, we do have a form letter up, and we're encouraging people to write, trying to draw attention of our federal and provincial governments, the provincial government of Alberta mostly, to this issue. And we also have another campaign that I want to mention briefly around the McClellan Wetland Complex. So we're trying to ask Suncor not to drill this very important peatland in northern Alberta. A few other links that I have up are just for events and newsletters. And I'd be happy to take any questions about any of that. With that, I'd just like to thank the other conservation staff at AWA and all the people working on sage-grouse who spoke with me about this topic. And thank you for listening.